The U.S. is home to 63 national parks, which collectively cover areas of millions of acres of wilderness. The U.S. is also home to hundreds of forests and wilderness areas, which are all accessible to hikers looking for their next adventure. Some trails are easy and peaceful, while others are recommended for the most experienced hikers only. In the last few decades, investigators have noticed an eerie pattern of bizarre missing person cases occurring in these parks and forests, the majority of which have no clues or answers. Number 5. Gifford Pincho National Forest covers an area of around 1.3 million acres in southwest Washington. With the creation of the National Park Service in the 1900s, Gifford Pincho National Forest is often lumped in with the close-by Mount Rainier National Forest. To the west of Gifford Pincho sits Mount St. Helens, an area made infamous by the massive eruption in 1980. Mount Adams also sits within the bounds of Gifford Pincho, and sitting at an elevation of over 12,276 feet, it's a popular spot for the most advanced mountaineers. While the forest sits in a mountainous region of the state, it still has tranquil pockets of forest on offer for those who are less experienced. According to the National Park Service website, there's an abundance of campgrounds, including Canyon Creek. Canyon Creek may be small, but it's mighty and the perfect spot for a small group looking to embark on a hike. 19-year-old Maureen Kelly was one of these hikers, but unfortunately for her and her friends, their camping trip would end in tragedy. Maureen, who went by the nickname of Anu, was born on September 26, 1993, and raised in Vancouver, Washington by her mother. Anu also grew up with 2 brothers and had an abundance of friends. She was described as a free spirit with boundless energy. During her time at Lewis and Clark High School, Anu expressed an interest in becoming a singer. In her free time, Anu would make ukulele videos and post them to YouTube in the hopes of kickstarting her singer-songwriter career. After graduating from high school, Anu wasn't sure what direction she wanted to take in life, but there was one thing she did want to accomplish. She told her friends and family that she wanted to embark on a spiritual quest and was looking to connect with her Pacific Islander heritage. In the summer of 2013, Anu caught wind that a group of her friends were planning a camping trip to the Gifford Pincho National Forest. Upon hearing this, she immediately began packing her bags, realizing that this was the perfect chance for her to embark on her spiritual adventure. On June 9, 2013, Anu and her friends made their way down the brushy roads to reach Canyon Creek Campground before settling on a spot. While Anu was enthusiastic about her trip, she didn't own any camping gear and had to borrow it from a family member. Her brother later commented that while Anu was comfortable in the great outdoors, she was perhaps not as prepared for this trip as she should have been. The group settled into the campsite, lighting the fire and drawing up plans for the rest of the evening. Around 5 p.m., Anu stripped off all of her clothes, leaving them in a pile near the fire. She grabbed her bag, equipped with a blade, a compass, and some matches, and told her friends that she was heading into the woods to complete her spiritual quest. Her friends later told the police that they believed she would be back soon, and that the spiritual quest was something that they felt she, quote, needed to do. Anu herself had told the group that she would be back sometime around midnight, but that was the last time she was ever seen or heard from. The area around Canyon Creek Campground is described as incredibly steep with difficult terrain. Anu had also left her shoes behind at camp, adding yet another obstacle to her trip. Her friends added that on June 9th, conditions were fair and sunny, and they had no reason to be concerned for Anu's welfare. She seemed lucid and sober and appeared to have every intention of coming back. Hours passed and the group stayed by the campfire, waiting for her to return, but she never did. Sometime after midnight on June 10th, 2013, Anu was reported missing by her friends to the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. Hours later, the official search for Anu began, with the Skamania County Sheriff's Office taking to the skies. Their search was hampered early on by bad weather conditions that limited visibility. Searchers on the ground quickly realized how much underbrush was around Canyon Creek, meaning that Anu could be anywhere and they may not even spot her. The search continued into June 11th, with helicopters now able to take to the skies and get a better look. Meanwhile, searchers on foot stumbled into their first and only clue. When Anu left, she was nude and without shoes. Searchers found bare footprints that matched Anu's shoe size. According to reports, these prints crossed Canyon Creek before heading north towards Forest Service Road 54. The footprints led to the paved road where they abruptly stopped. Canine units were brought in to search for Anu, but they were unable to pick up any of her scent. Volunteers and expert search and rescue crews continued looking for Anu for 5 days until it became abundantly clear there was no sign of her. On June 15, 2013, the search for Anu was officially suspended by the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. After the official search was ended, Anu's friends and family continued searching for her, but no sign of her has ever been found. None of her personal belongings have ever been recovered. Search and rescuers commented how difficult it would have been for Anu to climb up the steep terrain towards Service Road 54 barefoot. Without the proper equipment or clothing, it's likely that she succumbed to the elements or was injured. Some of Anu's friends believe that she may not have wanted to be found, and perhaps started a new life. It's been over 10 years since she disappeared, and investigators are yet to find any conclusive evidence as to what happened to her. Maureen Kelly is described as a Pacific Islander female with brown hair, brown eyes, 5'7", and 150 to 160 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective Jeremy Schultz of the Skamania County Sheriff's Office at 509-427-9490, quoting case number 1304081. Number 4. The Mount Hood National Forest sits just about 60 miles from the big city of Portland, Oregon, and remains a popular tourist attraction for experienced and casual hikers alike. The forest spans over 1 million acres and is home to the Columbia River, along with other rivers, streams, and mountains. According to the National Park Service, there are 8 designated wilderness areas with plenty of campsites and rest areas for those looking to spend extended amounts of time in the wilderness. For 57-year-old Robert Perry Bissell, the Roaring River Wilderness, which encompasses over 36,000 acres, was the most attractive for his latest adventure. The wilderness area has rivers, hills, and other challenging terrain to put even the most experienced hikers to the test. His family described him as a veteran hiker and camper who would spend extended periods in the woods and forest. When not working, Robert would often spend his time hiking and was always in search of the perfect isolated area to fish and live off the land. On July 12, 2010, Robert left his home in Portland, Oregon, telling his family he was headed to the Roaring River Wilderness area close to Rock Lakes. According to experts, he arrived at that area that day, leaving his white 1989 Nissan Sentra at Trailhead 700 before heading into the forest. Before leaving for his trip, Robert filed a permit with the U.S. Forest Service, which declared he was going to be returning from his trip by June 16, 2010. Unfortunately, his deadline was missed, and Robert was never seen or heard from again. 3 days after his permit ran out, Robert's brother ventured into the Roaring River Wilderness in search of him. After hiking for 5 miles, Robert's brother came across his campsite near Trail 512, close to Middle Rock Lake. There was no sign of Robert at the campsite, and the only items left behind were his sleeping bag and other equipment. Robert's fishing rod and kit were missing, leading his brother to believe that he'd ventured into the wilderness in search of a fishing spot. Before leaving, Robert's brother left a note on his Nissan Sentra, asking him to call him as soon as possible. Several more days would pass without word from Robert, and that's when his family knew something was very wrong. Finally, on July 24, 2010, Robert Bissell was reported missing to the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. As Robert had been missing for 12 days, a search team was put together immediately. The Clackamas County Sheriff's Office, the Oregon Army National Guard, and other search and rescue teams banded together in search of Robert. The Oregon Army National Guard provided the team with a helicopter to search the forest, while search and rescue teams, along with a canine unit, searched on the ground. According to reports, the searchers focused their efforts on the Roaring River Wilderness, Rock Lakes Basin, Serene Lake, Shining Lake, and Shell Rock Lake. At least 25 volunteers also joined the search for Robert, along with around 700 professionals, including the sheriff's office. The canine units were unable to find any trace of Robert, and no sign of him was found along any of the trails. During the search, several hikers came forward, claiming to have seen Robert around July 12th, but they were unable to provide any information as to where he could have gone. It's believed that Robert headed to Shell Rock Lake or one of the other lakes to fish. The search for Robert spanned several days, but as the search went on, it was clear to investigators that they were not going to find any sign of him. According to the Charlie Project, the terrain of Mount Hood National Forest was so rough that at least 3 horses threw their shoes, and other searchers struggled to navigate the terrain. The Clackamas County Sheriff's Office told the media they believed that Robert became injured during his hike, or may have fallen while traversing the tough terrain. Several items were found during the search for Robert, but his brother confirmed that they didn't belong to him. After several days, the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office made the difficult decision to suspend the search for Robert Bissell. Since he disappeared, no sign of him has ever been found. His body, along with his fishing gear, remains missing, and what happened to him remains a complete mystery. Robert Perry Bissell is described as a white male with gray hair, green eyes, 5'5" and 135 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective Eric Lee of the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office at 503-785-5000, quoting case number 2010-22782. Number 3. 21-year-old Nancy Elaine Lechner and 20-year-old Pamela Nader were typical 20-somethings in the 1960s America. Pamela Nader of Largo, Florida, and her boyfriend Ben Dodderman first began their relationship in 1964 and would sneak as many moments together as possible at her parents' home. By 1966, Ben was preparing to propose to his girlfriend and was picturing what their future may look like. Unfortunately, one hiking trip would change the course of their relationship forever. According to the Tampa Bay Times, Pamela, who graduated from Clearwater High School in 1964, was a typical young woman of the time. She loved the Beatles and was excited by the prospect of someday marrying Ben. Similarly, her friend Nancy Elaine Lechner, who graduated from Largo High School, also loved the Beatles and had dreams of becoming a flight attendant. The two bonded over their love of fashion, and Nancy would often make her own dresses. By 1966, Nancy was also engaged to Craig Mackey, and like her friend, she was looking forward to her wedding and what her future would look like. On October 2nd, 1966, Ben and Pam proposed an exciting afternoon for the four. Ben wanted to head to Alexander Springs in the Ocala National Forest to test out his new scuba diving suit. Nancy and Craig agreed to join them, and early that morning, the group headed into the forest. At around 11 a.m., the group arrived at the Ocala National Forest. After parking their cars and setting up a base camp, Ben hastily donned his new suit and headed into the waters. According to reports, the girls declined to swim in the waters because it was either too shallow or too cold. Instead, the girls took a short walk around the picnic area and began preparing the food for the picnic the group had planned later. Reports differ on what happened next, and there are a few accounts put forward. The first account is presented by the Doe Network, who claim the women packed up the picnic baskets around dinner time, taking them back to the parking lot. After repacking their baskets, the women are believed to have headed into the woods, telling their partners that they were going to take a short walk while they waited for them to finish in the water. Ben and Craig later told the police that they last saw them at 1:30 p.m. At around 1:55 p.m., the two men were reported to have rented a canoe and continued on the waters. By 2:55, the men returned to shore, only to find the two women gone. It wasn't until around 4 p.m. that they began to worry. The next account is presented by the Tampa Bay Times, which reports that Ben and Craig last saw Pam and Nancy between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. when they were at the picnic tables. The two men went into the water and upon their return realized they were missing. Ben later told the Tampa Bay Times that at first they were more angry than worried as the women had wandered off. After failing to find them, they ventured down the same trails they believed them to have taken, but failed to find any sign of them. It was at this point that they became concerned. Sources agree that sometime after 4 p.m., Ben and Craig ran to the nearest phone and reported both women missing to the Lake County Sheriff's Office. A search was immediately started, and unfortunately Ben and Craig found themselves under the intense scrutiny of the Lake County Sheriff's Office. Despite being able to attest to being on the waters of Alexander Springs all afternoon, the Lake County Sheriff's Office became convinced that the pair had something to do with their girlfriends' disappearances. Volunteers and members of the Lake County Sheriff's Office were sent out into the Ocala National Forest to look for any sign of the pair, while other officers stayed behind to interview Craig and Ben. A search of the picnic area showed that Nancy had left her glasses behind. Both women had also left their handbags, clothes, and shoes, implying that they didn't plan to be gone for long. According to the Doe Network, other visitors of the Ocala National Forest claimed to have seen Nancy on a trail at around 12:30 p.m., an hour before she disappeared. These hikers also claimed that an hour later, at 1:30 p.m., they saw Pamela close to the same trail. A canoeist also came forward, claiming they had seen both Pamela and Nancy on a trail sometime between 1:30 and 2 p.m. The witness claimed to have spoken to the women, although it's never been revealed what was said. Another witness would also come forward to the Lake County Sheriff's Office, claiming to have seen a man following the pair on one of the trails. For days, the Lake County Sheriff's Office poured man-hours and money into searching every inch of Alexander Springs and the wider Ocala National Forest area. Grid searches were organized, with volunteers meticulously searching every inch of the trails, but ultimately no sign of the women has ever been found. Around a week after the pair disappeared and their news hit the headlines, the Lake County Sheriff's Office revealed a bizarre call from a possible witness. This witness told investigators he had seen the women on October 2, 1966, but not in the picnic area. He claimed that at around 2 p.m. that day, he saw women matching Pamela and Nancy's descriptions in a Mustang on County Road 445, heading towards Astor, Florida. The witness claimed the two women in the back of the car appeared terrified, as two men sat up front. The car was driving erratically, speeding down the road with no regard for other drivers. The report came from the Doe Network, which also reported that days after the women disappeared, the Lake County Sheriff's Office found a burnt-out Mustang in Ocala National Forest. The account from the witness was never verified, and it's unclear if the Mustang is related to the case. The car had also been stolen from Daytona the day before, or the day that the two women disappeared. Ben and Craig found themselves under intense scrutiny, but the Lake County Sheriff's Office was able to later confirm that neither man was involved in the disappearance of Nancy or Pam. The pair would later recall their experience to the Tampa Bay Times years later, stating that it added even more stress to an already stressful situation. A week after the two disappeared, search efforts were called off, and no sign of either woman has ever been found. Their cases would lay cold for several decades until 2007, when the Lake County Sheriff's Office held a press conference in which they announced a stunning new advancement in the cases. During their press conference, the authorities announced that they believed Gerard Schaefer Jr. was responsible for their disappearances. Between 1972 and 1973, Gerard Schaefer is believed to have taken the lives of dozens of women across Florida. There's no conclusive evidence to link Schaefer to Nancy and Pam's disappearance, but according to reports, the Lake County Sheriff's Office used jailhouse confessions and witness sightings of a man following the young women to come to this conclusion. Unfortunately, decades later, Nancy and Pam's case remains unsolved, and until new evidence or witness testimony comes to light, their cases will likely remain this way. Pamela Ann Nader is described as a white female with brown hair, brown eyes, 5'3" to 5'5", and 120 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Lieutenant James Delamone of the Lake County Sheriff's Office at 352-343-9529. Number 2. The Fremont-Wenema National Forest encompasses an area of over 2.2 million acres in South Oregon. The Wenema National Forest alone encompasses over 1 million acres and sits close to the Cascade Mountain Range. With plenty of camping areas and nature trails, the Wenema National Forest is a popular spot for tourists and experienced hikers alike. The Wenema National Forest is also a popular spot for locals to pick out the perfect Christmas tree. December of 1998, Derek James Enga and his family in Bonanza, Oregon, were preparing for a happy and peaceful Christmas period ahead. Like many locals close to the Wenema National Forest, the Enga had planned on visiting the forest to pick out 3 trees. Derek, the youngest of the Enga was the most excited for the trip. Friends and family described Derek as an excitable and energetic young man, whom they often called Bear Boy due to his love of the great outdoors. He was halfway through the 3rd grade and showed great promise academically. The area of Bonanza, Oregon, where the family lived, was forested, and Derek was used to being amongst the trees. He was also the family's mushroom picker, priding himself on being able to squeeze into spots nobody else could to grab the best mushrooms. It's fair to say that Derek enjoyed both an academic education and an outdoor education. On the weekends, Derek would join his father, Robert, and his grandfather, Bob, on their hunts through the woods of Bonanza. Derek watched in awe as his father and grandfather took down deer, bobcats, and even crossed paths with a bear. Despite being exposed to the outdoors from an early age, Derek was still young and had the same fears that his peers did. He was afraid of the dark, but more specifically what was lurking in it, and cougars. The Enga men had not originally planned to get a real pine tree for Christmas of '98, as Lori, the matriarch of the family, had complained about the mess that real trees made. But Robert was compelled to grab some when his disabled neighbor asked if he was going that year. Knowing his neighbor was physically unable to get his own, Robert Enga accompanied his crew and made a plan. On the afternoon of June 5, 1998, Robert, Bob, and Derek piled into the family's red Toyota pickup truck and began the drive to Wenema National Forest. Shortly before 2 p.m., they made it to the forest and began driving into Rocky Point. The car slowly pulled to a stop in a small gravel parking lot, and Derek began to beam with excitement. Robert had to stop his son from jumping out of the car and running into the forest, as he wasn't dressed for the weather. After calming Derek down, Robert dressed him in his blue snowsuit, a hat, and felt-lined boots. Bob remarked to Robert that they didn't have long in Rocky Point, as sundown was due at 4 p.m. Before arriving at Rocky Point, the men purchased permits to cut down 3 pine trees so they wouldn't get into any trouble. Once the men were dressed, they began a short hike into the woods. Derek, who was armed with a hatchet, was eager to run ahead and spot the perfect tree before his father and grandfather did. But for the moment, he remained by their sides. As he made his way through the woods, he chipped away small ridges into the trees that he passed, practicing for when it would be his turn to cut down his Christmas tree. After making it around 150 yards into the woods, Robert Enga Derek's father, told the others he was going to walk ahead. He asked Bob to look after Derek, and he would shout for them once he'd found the right spot. For a few minutes, Derek walked by his grandfather's side, but the excitement of the afternoon was getting to him. As the pair walked, he nagged at his grandfather to let him run ahead to his dad. He was adamant that he wanted to be the first to spot the Christmas trees for that year, a competition that he'd made in his own head. Eventually, Robert relented to Derek's incessant nagging and told him he could run ahead, but to make sure that he went straight to his father. Derek assured his grandfather that he could hear his father's footsteps in the distance, and he would be there within minutes. This was the last time that Derek Enga was ever seen or heard from again. Sometime later, Robert shouted for his father, telling him he'd found the right trees. When Bob arrived, Robert asked him where Derek was. Bob explained that he'd sent Derek to find him. Robert turned pale. He explained to his father that Derek had never made it to him. The pair immediately ran through the woods, screaming Derek's name, but there was no response. The sun slowly began to set over Rocky Point in Klamath County, and the pair knew Derek was terrified of the dark. Bob and Robert needed to find Derek soon. His fear of the dark may have forced him to take refuge in a dangerous part of the park. They also feared that if he was running, he may have injured himself. The temperatures were also freezing, and while he was wearing a snowsuit, he wouldn't last long when temperatures dropped overnight. The pair spent around an hour desperately looking for Derek, but there was no sign of him. There were no tiny footprints in the snow, and no response to their calls. Around 4 p.m., the two ran to the nearest road and flagged down a passing motorist. Within minutes, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene and began taking the report. The search for Derek Enga started right away, given his age and the temperatures. Volunteers also joined the search efforts as the night went on, but the search for Derek was about to become strange. Just as searches were getting underway at Rocky Point, the area was hit by a blizzard, forcing searchers back to comfort and safety and erasing any footprints Derek may have left behind. The only clue in Derek's case had now been washed away, and the Klamath County Sheriff's Office were back to square one. Once the weather had died down overnight, searches continued, but unfortunately no sign of Derek was found. When Derek's disappearance hit the local news, more and more volunteers poured into the Winema National Forest. His story had shaken the local community, and they believed that the strength of the search for him was in numbers. Despite temperatures dipping well below freezing, the residents of Bonanza turned out to find Derek. A few days into the search, they came across a shocking clue. Near Rocky Point, where Derek had disappeared, some searchers found a Bonanza school bookmark and a candy wrapper. It's never been officially confirmed whether these items belonged to Derek, but we do know that Derek was enrolled at Bonanza High School in 1998 and was in the 3rd grade. As searchers pushed further into the woods, they also found another troubling clue, a crude shelter that had been made under fallen logs on a mountain. According to reports, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office immediately ordered canine search dogs to search the area, but they didn't detect Derek's scent at the shelter. It's unknown whether this was made by Derek or if it was a sheer coincidence. As the days went by, the hopes of finding Derek began to fade. Investigators knew that he wouldn't have been able to survive the harsh conditions without food, water, and shelter. A blizzard and bad weather had passed through the area, making the fight for survival all the more difficult. A week or so after Derek disappeared, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office received a troubling report. A witness came forward who claimed to have seen a man driving a black Honda at Rocky Point around the same time Derek disappeared. While this could have been explained away as another person looking for a Christmas tree, it's what comes next that worries investigators. The witness also claimed to have seen an unidentified man struggling with someone fitting Derek's description at Rocky Point. The witness was not able to give a detailed description and just assumed that the man was the boy's father and was trying to get him back into the car. Up until this point, investigators had no reason to believe that Derek had been abducted, but now the state of the case had changed. In the initial days of the investigation, Robert and Bob were interviewed at length. The pair even took lie detector tests, and after a few days they were ruled out as suspects, as it was found they were telling the truth. For the Engelbrettsons, an idyllic day had turned into the stuff of nightmares. Eventually, the search for Derek was called off, as no other clues were uncovered. Derek's family were heartbroken and forced to spend the first of many Christmases without him. The local community rallied behind the Engelbrettson family, and while the official search for Derek had ended, they continued to trudge the area looking for any sign of him. In 1999, a terrifying clue came to light. According to CBS travelers making their way through Oregon, they stopped at a rest area in 1999 when one of them excused themselves to the bathroom. Moments later, they returned with a look of horror on their face. They explained that there was graffiti on the wall that specifically mentioned Derek's case, who had disappeared a year earlier by this point. Authorities were immediately called to the scene, and their graffiti was processed and sent straight to the Oregon Crime Lab. Reports of this graffiti soon hit local news, but to this day, police have refused to reveal what the graffiti said. All they'll say is that it was Derek specific, while not actually bearing his name. According to later reports, this graffiti was analyzed and deemed to be a joke, but there are many not convinced by this verdict, and they believe that the graffiti has more to do with Derek's case than the police are letting on. For years, Derek's case went cold. That was until the 2000s. In 2004, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office specifically named Frank J. Milligan as the person of interest. By 2004, Milligan was serving 62 years in prison for a crime that bore some similarities to Derek's case. The new theory that officers were running with was that Milligan picked Derek up from the roadside that he'd made it to after running through the woods of Rocky Point. The Klamath County Sheriff's Office interviewed Milligan for several weeks, during which he confessed to taking Derek. Milligan promised the police he would take officers to the site of the crime, but when taken to Rocky Point, he was unable to point anything out. After this, Milligan recanted his confession and has since refused to cooperate with the case. There's no evidence to conclusively connect him to Derek's case, and no formal charges have ever been filed. December is a painful month for the Enga Bretsons, who've been without answers for decades. If still alive today, Derek would be 33 years old. Derek is described as a white male with brown hair, hazel eyes, 4'6" and 85 pounds at the time of his disappearance. Anyone with information is asked to contact Sergeant Monty Holloway of the Klamath County Sheriff's Office at 541-883-5130, quoting case number 983506. Number 1. To many, 53-year-old Sandra Lynn Johnson Hughes was living the dream life. She had no long-term relationship, no children, and nothing holding her back from following her heart. Sandra's dream was to visit as many parks, forests, and outdoor areas across mainland US and US territories as possible, before she'd be forced to stop. By 2020, Sandra visited a plethora of these parks and forests, and was well on her way to making her dream come true. But there were just a few things on her list. Unfortunately, the next big hike that she'd planned would turn out to be her last. By 2020, Sandra was living in California. She'd recently moved there from Maui, Hawaii, as she had parks and forests in California that she wanted to visit. Sandra's love of the outdoors had started in childhood in the 1960s and stayed with her through adulthood. During her time at college, Sandra took a course to become a park ranger, and as a result, she was proficient in survivalism and navigating the dangerous terrain that the US has to offer. In June of 2020, Sandra told her family that she had a new trip planned out. This trip would see her hike from the Sierra National Forest all the way to the Yosemite National Forest, which borders the Sierra. She also told her family that she wanted to do this alone, something that worried them. While Sandra was more than capable of being in the great outdoors, her family told her that they would feel better if she stuck with a group. Sandra declined this idea, and according to the project, the last time they heard from Sandra was on June 26, 2020, which we can assume was around the start of her trip. Other hikers passed Sandra in Johnson Meadows in the Sierra National Forest, with the last sighting of her being on July 4th. Things prior to the July 4th sighting appeared to be fine, but it would be this final sighting that worried investigators. According to other hikers in the Sierra National Forest, on July 4th, they came across a disheveled Sandra. She wasn't wearing any shoes and had a big bruise on her face. Of course, they were concerned for their fellow hiker and offered her footwear, water, food, and help, but Sandra declined everything offered to her. She assured them that she was a trained park ranger and was capable of looking after herself. After this, Sandra walked into the national forest and was never seen or heard from again. When Sandra didn't contact her family during July, they assumed she was deep in the woods of the Sierra and Yosemite National Forests. But as August crept closer, they became extremely worried. Sandra was eventually reported missing to the Madera Sheriff's Office, and the search for her began. The Madera Sheriff's Office discovered that on July 5, 2020, the day after she was last seen, Sandra's campsite was found by fellow hikers. According to reports, the campsite was in a state of disarray. Her belongings were scattered all over, and it appeared she had dragged everything from her car and thrown it into the campsite. But bizarrely though, her car was nowhere to be found. 5 miles from Sandra's disheveled campsite, investigators found her car, which was in poor condition. According to the Charlie Project, the silver Saab 95 had crashed into a tree at a slow speed before being rolled into a nearby ravine. It was determined that this car wouldn't have been traveling any faster than 20 miles an hour. So what had happened? To this day, investigators are still baffled by the state of Sandra's car and campsite. Sandra didn't leave behind any notes or notes at trailheads to suggest which path she may have taken to Yosemite. Some sightings of Sandra were made throughout the park, but the Madera Sheriff's Office has never been able to verify that this was Sandra. 4 years later, Sandra's case remains a complete mystery. Why did she have a bruise on her face, and why was her car crashed? Sandra Lynn Johnson Hughes is described as a white female with brown hair, brown eyes, 5'3" and 150 pounds. At the time of her disappearance, Sandra had dyed her hair blue. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Madera Sheriff's Office at 559-675-7770. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.